Hey everybody, welcome back. When I was working on this latest episode of Stonks on Rails about enterprise scale data, it really got me thinking about how learning other programming languages have actually made me a much better Ruby on Rails developer. Many of the best Rails developers I know actually started out with a Java background. And the thing about Ruby that attracted them to the language is its simplicity and how you could get a lot done with just a few lines of code. And this is quite the opposite of the way Java works, where you have to write a lot of explicit declarations and a lot of boilerplate in order to get something very simple done. And one example of this is getter and setter methods, which you have to explicitly declare on classes in Java. So think of Java as having a lot of safeguards and training wheels to protect the programmer from writing his own poorly structured code. But Ruby does the opposite, where it gives the programmer the rope to hang himself with. And because of this nature of Ruby, I've seen a lot of really badly written Ruby on Rails code. As I've mentioned in my last video, you could really make a mess of Ruby if you're handling complex data structures like you see in a business application, because a variable could be anything. You could have a complex data structure like a form or some type of metadata that changes over time, and what could happen is you might have references to something on that object like a hash that doesn't exist anymore or was updated, or maybe you're inferring the wrong data type and you're trying to add two numbers together, but they're actually strings. Ruby won't protect you from that, and you could actually have bugs that sit in your code for a very long time, and they won't pop up until you get a no method error or some type of a incompatible type error later on when you're actually running the code in production. That's why extensive test coverage is such an important best practice in Ruby on Rails. But even if you've got great RSpec tests, the lack of strongly typed variables enables you to write very difficult to understand code. So, for example, many of the Ruby programs that I've looked at, including some popular gems, have method calls that are nested through many layers, and they're passing variables containing complex data through these many layers of chained method calls. And as a new person looking at this code, it can be very difficult to figure out what's being passed from method to method. You might be trying to find a bug and trying to figure out where the processing is going wrong. Or you might be trying to add a condition to change one of the outputs. And unless you're using some sort of a trace debugger, like binding.pry, and even then, it could still be difficult to figure out if you're doing it correctly and what the original programmer's intentions were. When I write Ruby on Rails code, I'm actually approaching it with a different perspective. And that's because Ruby on Rails wasn't the first language I learned. Long before I was doing Ruby on Rails development, I learned C and C++. And some of the concepts that the C world taught me were about the type safety of variables and type casting and the difference between an object and a pointer to an object, how to effectively use class inheritance, and how to think of every object within the program as its own independent data container. So you kind of lose that in Rails because everything's so much blended together when you're using the model view controller design pattern. There's also Ruby mix-ins, which allow you to add functionality to classes with a single line, and you could also add a whole DSL that allows you to do one-liner declarations that add functionality to that class. And it might add a little bit of magic and maybe even human readability to some of the code, make it more concise, but that comes at the expense of not really knowing everything that's going on under the hood, and you have much less of a technical understanding of how the program works. Another language that's taught me how to be a much better Ruby developer was Elixir. Now, Elixir hasn't really taken off in popularity, but playing around with it's taught me how to think more in a functional programming mindset. When you're dealing with functional programming, there are no classes that are going to be instantiated that hold data in them. Instead, whatever data that you're working with in the program is passed in its entirety through the program, and then the method calls do operations on that data, much like a product running through an assembly line. And learning the methodologies used in Elixir have caused me to think of my Ruby functions in a different way. And now I structure them more in terms of how I could simplify the interfaces between my method calls and my classes. Inside of the Elixir language, there's a unique syntax called piping, which is just a way of chaining methods together. Now, Ruby doesn't really have this built into it, but you can mimic the way that Elixir does piping through chaining method calls, as you kind of do when you're building an active record query. And it's because of that thought process is the reason that I have my own set of best practices. For example, I only pass one instance variable from my Rails controller into the template. Now, I realize some of the vocabulary I used in this video might be a little advanced for some members of my audience, and maybe some of the concepts were a little bit abstract. But the main point of this video is that other programming languages introduce you to design concepts that will help you write better, more structured Ruby code. Now, Ruby on Rails is great because it gives you the flexibility to get a lot of work done really quickly. Because unlike Java, you don't have to write a whole lot of boilerplate code. However, that flexibility of Ruby is a double-edged sword because it also enables you to write very spaghettified code. Anyway, I hope this video was some interesting food for thought. If you're thinking about learning Ruby, or you're kind of somewhere in the middle of your Ruby on Rails adventure, give it a thumbs up if you found it to be useful, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more content like this. See you next time.